Welcome back. In this video, we are going to add puddles and a puddle generator to our map. But first of all, we have to solve a problem that occurs when we use multiple textures in cycles set to 3D. There's an interesting effect that we get in cycles when we mix a whole bunch of noise textures together, when we use the 3D mode and then we try and create a mask using the less than node. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a color mix color node, and A is going to be our mud. So we'll just give this a kind of dark brown color, maybe a little bit more desaturated. And B is going to be our water. Now it's going to be muddy water. We're not going to be able to see through it to the bottom of the mud, which is a good thing because that's not something that we can easily do on a texture where we're essentially going to make our puddles flat. So we're going to give this a kind of lighter color, a little bit desaturated, this kind of light brown water. We are going to take this value, plug it into our factor, and let's look at our base color. So this is what we have here. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to use this less than node to create a mask. So everything that's below a certain level, for example, 0.3 is going to be a puddle. So we want that to be a different color. Now, obviously we have a couple of things that we have to fix. We need to flatten out these puddles because this doesn't look realistic. Now we do have a displacement node in here. So what we can do is we can just plug in a mix color node just before our displacement node. And what we want to do is we want to use the same value we have for threshold in color B. And we want to use this as a mask. So you can see at the moment, if we just use this as a mask and we have a color in here, we can essentially raise and lower the height of these puddles. But what we want to do is we want these puddles to be the exact same height as where this mask starts. And we already have that because we have this threshold. So to make things a little bit easier, let's just grab an input value node. We're going to plug in 0.3, plug this value here, and plug this value here. So now these change at the same rate. So essentially this value node has just become a water level node. So you can see as we increase that water level, not only does it change color, but it also gets flatter. So that's going to be incredibly useful. We also have an issue with roughness because at the moment, our entire map is the same roughness, but obviously we want our water to be extremely reflective. So let's grab a color, mix color node. We'll plug this into our roughness. Again, B is going to be our water. So we want our water to be very, very shiny. Let's plug our factor in here. And now you can see that we have our nice reflective puddles. On our less reflective mud, we can always go in here and we can adjust these values as well. So our mud is still looking a little bit wet, but not as wet. But hopefully now you can start to see the issue that we actually have with our texture. So it might not be very clear from a distance, but once we get really up close to these puddles, you can see that we have some strange areas. So our water towards the edge of these puddles starts to get a little bit warped. So let's look at it from the top down. And here's a few good examples. So we have some displacement here where we should have flat water. And there's probably some areas here and there where we actually have mud, which should be displaced, which is also flat. So this is an issue with cycles, because if we change over to Eevee, you can see that our texture where we have our puddles is completely flat and only our mud area is getting distorted there. Now, you may think, well, we can just use Eevee, but unfortunately Eevee doesn't support displacement. So in actual fact, we're getting a flat texture here. Now, depending on the reason you're creating this texture, maybe you won't be using displacement anyway. Maybe it's going to end up being a shader for a game. So maybe it works out a little bit better that you'd be building your texture in Eevee like this. But we have to find a workaround so that we can continue working with our displacement. So let's go into this top view and I'll show you exactly what that workaround is. And it's quite simple and it's not very obvious. And it's a solution that I came across just by experimenting. What we have to do is we have to take all our 3D textures and turn them into 2D textures. Now, I'm not sure why this fixes the issue. All I know is it does fix the issue. But you can see now that we have much less issues around the edges of our puddles. We still have a little bit of an issue, but that is generally just down to the fact that our dicing on our viewport displacement is a little bit high at the moment. At the moment, let's see what that dicing actually is. So at the moment it's set to 2 pixels. If I change that to 1 pixel, and in order to just come out of this and check it, we'll just go into solid mode and then back into cycles, and that'll figure everything back out. You can see that it's actually pretty smooth. Now, one other thing that we have an issue with is we have a lot of high peaks on our texture. So we do have a couple of little issues, and we're just going to go through our texture and try and figure out what those issues are. Okay, so one of the things that I've mentioned a few times throughout the course, I've maybe droned on about it a little bit, is that when we do bump maps and displacement maps and things like that, we don't want to be using values below 0 or above 1. Now, a really easy way to check that is by just grabbing a converter math node, setting this to less than, and then we can just check some of our values. So there are 2 maps in here that may cause issues, difference and logarithm. Let's look at our difference map. We'll plug this into value, and we're just going to look at this from the top down. What we want to do is we want to check different thresholds in here to see what our values are. So let's go to 0. We don't see any white, so we know we have no values less than 0. And if we put this to 1, it should be all white. Okay, so it is all white. Let's just decrease this threshold until we see some black coming in. Okay, so we get some black coming in around about 0.5. So we know all our values coming out of this difference node are between 0 and 0.5. Let's look at this logarithm node. So we'll go to 0. So again, we don't have any values below 0. Let's check 1. And you can see that we still have some black in here. So now we know for a fact that we have values coming out of this logarithm map that are above 1. So what we want to do is we want to increase this until all that black goes away. Okay, and that's it, just about gone. So we have a value of about 3.39 in there. So we know that our highest value coming out of logarithm is 3.39, or let's just round it up to 3.4. So we want to kind of fix that back into a range that we're happy with. So I'm going to grab a couple of these nodes, move them out of the way a little bit, and we have to plug in a node in here to fix this. So let's grab a converter map range node. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our minimum, which we know from this threshold. So let's try and increase this until we see some white. So we know our lowest value is around about 0.25. So just to be safe, let's put in 0.2. And we know our maximum value is around about 3.4. So if we go into a top view and we look at the result of our logarithm, you can see it's quite bright and we have quite a distinct noise texture happening. If we go into our map range node now that we've clamped it down, or not clamped it, but we've remapped it to a 0 to 1 range, it's darker, but we still have the exact same noise in there. We're just using values between 0 and 1. So now if you look at our output, we're getting something that's a little bit nicer. We have less of those really strong peaks, which were being caused by those values of about 3, 3.4, and that's pretty much fixed that. Now, one thing that I'll point out is our value node here that we're using as our water level. At the moment, our puddles are taking up maybe just under 50% of the surface, but we're only at a value of 0.1. So you can see that if we increase this to around about 0.4, we don't have any mud at all. ideally we'd like a value of 0.5 to be 50% of our height. Even at about 0.25, I would like this to be basically hardly any water in the scene. So we know that we have another little issue here. So we have fixed our map range here, then we plug in this mix node, things get a bit lighter, and then we plug in this node, things get a little bit darker. So before we go into our less than node, we need to remap this one. Okay, so it's challenge time. So we know that we have an issue with the values coming out of our displacement frame and going into the mix node before it reaches the displacement. Your challenge is to remap those values, leaving the displacement frame back into a range of between 0 to 1. So you can use a math node set to less than to check your results. This will allow you to check the values, leaving that displacement frame, and allow you to plug in the correct values into a map range node. So pause the video and have a go at that, and I'll show you how I tackled it in just a moment. Okay, so we're going to add a math node. We're going to set that to less than, and let's just check our values. So first we'll check 0. We don't have any values under 0. We'll check 0.5 and all our values are under 0.5. So let's just adjust this, and it looks like our value is around about 0.48. So those are the values that we're going to use in our map range node. So let's add one of those in, and we'll just use Control and left click and drag just to move these outputs back over to result. We'll put this in the frame and make a little bit of space, and we'll plug the result into the value. Now, minimum stays at 0, maximum goes to, let's round that to 0.5. And now we can see our results there. If we look at our result, now we have something a lot nicer. So at 0.25, this is how much water we have. I think a value of about 0.2 is giving us some really nice shaped puddles, some really interesting patterns. And that's essentially it for our puddles. So within this video, we have made a few adjustments. Now, obviously our noise textures changed quite a bit when we changed from 3D to 2D. And some of our mud just looks a little bit lumpy and not super interesting. So that's something that we're going to fix in the next video. I'll see you then.